listening to the talks, I was thinking, well, you are talking about really amazing work, but there's so much backstory to that. So my first question is around the past and your background stories. So what led you to this moment? What are some of the, I guess, key events or any motivations that led you to this time? And we can start with Matt and then walk across the table.
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm in computational media at Duke, but I come from a very non-traditional background. I did my undergrad degree in urban planning at Cornell, and then a master's in new media and media studies at Penn State University. How did I get into this field? I was really interested in creative technologies, particularly around AI. And I found myself messing around with what at the time I think was state of the art, which was Google News Word2Vec, if any of you are familiar with that. And playing around with that and kind of reading up on the literature. And of course we know that Google News Word2Vec is brutally biased. So you can query words and then kind of measure the cosine similarity between words and other words. And if you query Google News Word2Vec, you'll find just really blatant biases in there. And I think that was kind of a turning point to me, where I started to move away from creative technologies and move towards bias and misuse in machine learning.
I guess I shared a bit of the backstory earlier, but predominantly I came from a background in trading and a background in trading energy, not in agriculture, but my interest in agriculture. So I guess my move into AI was driven off a desire to solve a problem that then led to a set of solutions which led me to build a team around it. But for me, what led me to be interested in agriculture was the financial crisis. I was trading in the thick of the financial crisis, and I sat next to a person who believed the world was coming to an end when everything was happening in 2008 and 2009. And I remember thinking, stock price of our bank going to zero, it'll suck, but it's not the end of the world. It'll be the end of the world if I don't have food to eat. And his reaction to the world coming to an end was buying as much gold as possible. And to spite him, I said, well, what if I bought a bunch of land, grew potatoes, and you had to give me a bar of gold for a sack of potatoes when the world doesn't come to an end? And so I looked at investing in agriculture to spite him. And in looking to do that, and I said, well, I want to buy it in the cheapest place possible, and that was not in the US. I was living in New York at the time. So I started looking at my home, Ethiopia, which was offering up lots of arable land for very, very cheap prices. And I started doing the math of what it would be if we actually had to build out a commercial operation as a farm. And not as a small-scale farmer, even as a large-scale commercial farmer. And I quickly realized that buying land at over $10,000 an acre in the Midwest in the end was cheaper than getting land at less than $1 an acre in Ethiopia. And that was because the entire system around the farm did not exist. So in the end, for you to be a farmer, you had to be your own insurer, you had to be your own credit provider, you had to be your own logistics provider, etc. So the cost of production was insanely high. And so that just led me down this crazy rabbit hole investigation for over 4 or 5 years, where I just was obsessed with why, until eventually I realized that I was doing my day job and I was very good at it, but I had developed this passion for this problem, so it was that.
So I started in math. I studied math in undergrad. And so both of my parents are in the medical field, so it was my goal not to go into medicine. But after I graduated, I really wanted to do applied math. And so I applied for an internship at the National Institutes of Health in the US. It seemed like the logical thing to do since I had grown up in the medical family, even though I didn't want to go to medical school. So I spent the summer working on looking at how to predict pregnancy outcomes using last menstrual period data. And I really loved the project, and I loved the freedom that I had to think through a research project and come up with my own solutions to this particular problem. And so I went to graduate school and studied statistics, but during that time I worked in a lab that was like 80% computer scientists and 20% public health, economists, and mathematicians. And it was really great. I got to learn a lot of computer science and decided to do a PhD in something that bridged public health and computer science. So I did computational epidemiology. And during my dissertation, I worked on developing the process for predicting disease outbreaks. So if we had a new infectious disease outbreak, pandemic, how do we predict how it's going to spread across the world? But I couldn't find data to test the models that I was developing, so I started looking to the internet. And to see if there was data available, contacted some people who were working in digital epidemiology, and they were very happy to share data. And I've been working on that ever since.
Thank you. I mean, I like the fact that each of your stories is so different, and yet you are making such impact in the various fields that you are working in. And I'm thinking, I mean, personally, I always think that I could be making more impact if I didn't have like these obstacles. So there's always something that you feel could be better if only some of these difficulties could go away. And so what I'm getting at is, what are the things that you think are slowing you down in your respective work? If you feel like you could be making a bigger impact, and you are not because of something specific, what is that? What is that big elephant in the room?
You know, one of the things that I am really pushing for is really better kind of like access to compute. To be able to develop large language models, even to be able to do kind of like the simple, you know, kind of like stuff that I was doing, you need access to compute. That compute costs money. What I really am getting at is, I think across academia, being able to tap into kind of like larger scale compute clusters like TAC would be very beneficial for plenty of you know, kind of like researchers. So I might say access to compute is kind of like the biggest thing that's, I think, slowing a lot of research down at the time.
I would say for us, it's people, and I've been told that I always grow the team too slow and not fast enough. And it's because we have a very, very thorough recruiting process that I think we're learning how to scale it. And that's because to solve a problem this complicated as what we're trying to solve, we believed from day one that the team that you build has to resemble the world that it's modeling, which meant diversity was a core tenet of how we recruit. And that's diversity in backgrounds, that's in academic backgrounds, professional backgrounds, diversity in nationality, diversity in age. And so when you start to kind of optimize across those metrics, you realize that, oh, and then we have one core value, which is a no asshole policy. So when you actually start to optimize for all that, you know, we don't compromise on the quality of people we bring into the team, and we've become a lot more aggressive in our recruiting, and we've gotten a lot better at it. But I think I'm probably one of the only CEOs that keeps a census. So 1 in 3 people in our company comes from a different nationality or is a different ethnicity. 1 in 3 people speaks at least one other language. So for us, it's about modeling the world we live in and intentionally recruiting a team around 2 locations, which is New York and Nairobi. To do that, and to do that well, has taken time.
I think for me, it's having access to the right stakeholders. So a lot of public health is still very traditional. We use survey data, we use data from public health surveillance data from public health organizations. So being able to have the people who need to use the things that we're producing actually use them is still a challenge. I think more and more public health departments, especially in the US, are starting to use more technology and use data from social media to make decisions, but it's still slow. We don't always have those stakeholders on board.
So to summarize, compute, building a team, and getting access to the right stakeholders. Okay, that makes sense. And before I open the floor for questions, I just have one last one around what the future holds. So as I think a lot of us are looking at the next thing that we are going to be working on. And one of the key questions is where do you feel like you could have the most impact? Where is that untapped potential that you could be working on, an opportunity other people haven't maybe seen that you can jump on and then have global impact while doing good, while doing social good. So if you were mentoring someone and they asked you, what should I be working on next? What would be your answer?
You know, I'm kind of like a lone researcher, so I don't really know if I think in a kind of like global perspective. I mean, I wouldn't change my answer from what I'm doing right now. I mean, I think bias is a massive problem. So much of it is unseen. So much of it is kind of like tucked away, and we're unable to kind of like tap into these models to see what kind of biases they hold. So I think you know, it's certainly not a profitable area, but it's an important area, and I would love to see much more research in this space.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would say is do something that moves you, as long as it's not selling more ads on the internet. And it's, and I say that lightheartedly, but it's actually really hard to find, you know, something that you deeply care about, because there's so much work that you do that requires social impact also requires a lot of grunt work. And you can't shy away from that grunt work when you're looking for the shiny, sexy stuff. And sometimes it's easy to just go for that versus say, how do I roll up my sleeves and just get to work? You know, when you're doing anything that is going to measurably change a system, anything that's going to change the world, it requires that. And so I think it means that being dedicated to the work you are doing becomes the most important thing. And I think that is agnostic to domain, really. But I feel like, you know, we're obviously doing a lot of impactful work, and food and agriculture is still very misunderstood. It is essential to humanity. It is the last industry left to be transformed by an information revolution. And so finding things like that, and just ultimately, though, I don't know, a moral compass. A moral compass is necessary in this.
For people who are interested in public health, I would say looking at ways to develop better surveillance, better interventions for non-communicable diseases in Africa, because we used to think in the past, things like obesity, hypertension, diabetes used to be diseases that we saw in higher income countries, but that is changing. So in Africa now, we're not just dealing with infectious diseases, but we're starting to deal with increases in obesity, in diabetes, in hypertension. We have more people dying from this disease and cancers as well. So if you're interested in using AI to solve a particular health problem, I would say look at those diseases in Africa.
There you go, 3 areas of research you could be working on for your next Black in AI paper. So I think we are ready to get questions from the audience. Anyone has a question? Yeah? I think you're just going to have to shout it, and then I will...
As always, thank you all for being here today. I first can't help but note the two last things that were said about food and agriculture and public health aren't separate, right? So I work in food systems as well, and the point is to increase fruits and vegetables consumptions because of the metabolic diseases. But my question was for the middle panelist, Sarah. So for the Ethiopian highlands, I know there's work being done there by environmental engineers, and you talked about a business valuation you did there, where you saw that the land there was very cheap, but about the development was too high, the development cost. So like at what point, I guess as a CEO, do you go and talk to like environmental engineers or like a Jacobs engineering company to see if it's worth it maybe like for a 10 or 20 year purview, because your successor will come in and they'll do the same business evaluation, and like if you push that forward, then obviously they'll have a different answer to their question.
I think this works. Yeah, okay. So it's actually, the issue is less about the land, and it's about the supporting infrastructure for the land. So if you become a farmer, the first asset you need is land, because you need the land to grow your food on, and that requires soil and water and all of these things. And these can have environmental assessments done on them. But then the next thing is you need access to seed, you need access to fertilizer, you need access to pesticides, etc. Which means you need to find that product close enough at a cheap enough cost to produce it. You then need to get money to be able to buy that input. So that means your financing cost needs to be cheap enough. Then you grow it. You need to move it. You need to either move it to a domestic market or you need to ship it out of the country. So that means you need trucking, you need roads, you need storage, all of that. So what made the economics not work is actually has nothing to do with the land. It has everything to do with the system to make the market function. And to me, it's, if you're in the business of banking or in the business of insurance, I remember going out to Ethiopia and asking the really large, this was at a time when China, the Middle East, and India in particular were buying large swaths of land in Africa. And I went to one of the really large companies and I said, hey, who's your crop insurance provider gonna be? You have like 300,000 acres. And they said, oh yeah, we're working on that. And I remember thinking, you are subject to the elements at all times. Like if you do not know how to hedge that risk, then 1 year your crop goes to zero, you go bankrupt. And so it's really about those aspects. And so the motivation for us was around how do I help price risk better for farmers? How do we create better insurance products as a result? How does one see market opportunities to build logistical networks so I as a farmer can remain a really good farmer and everybody else can do what they do well? In a country like Ethiopia, that entire infrastructure doesn't exist.
If anybody has more questions, could you guys come up and just line up here? That'd be great.
Hi, everyone. My question goes to Matthew. You've been talking about misuse of AI and all, so my simple question is, how best do you think we can get rid of it or reduce the number of cases of AI misuse? Is it through sensitization or developing algorithms that will track people to do that? How best can we do that?
I think it will take a really multifaceted approach, both understanding, like I said, kind of like historical approaches to disinformation, developing algorithms, certainly, to be able to track and take down these accounts, and also thinking about potential future misuses. And that's where I think the power of kind of, like red teaming comes into play. Both in the potential misuse in the current day, but also, like programming out other potential misuses, future misuses of all of these technologies. And I should say that this, maybe this is for bias, or I'm sorry, for disinformation, but it also works for bias as well, right? We could think of creating kind of like adversarial attacks against models, putting them in situations where they're making critical decisions and maybe outputting kind of like biased results. I think that's another approach that could be interesting and could do well with this framework.
Stephen O'Dowd, we're here, Retina AI. I've really enjoyed the session. I just want to thank all the keynote speakers. You guys have been excellent. I do have 2 questions for Sarah Menker, and that's because I'm also an entrepreneur, so I was listening very closely to your story. The first question is regarding what you identified as something that might be possibly holding you back from the next level, which is growing your team. You mentioned earlier that you have a certain approach to team meetings, weekly sessions, which you call your XM. Do you see that as something that is hindering your scaling? And also, is there a role for upskilling people within a team versus hiring the next person, in effect? That's my first question. Second question is regarding your background as a trader. What role does that play in what you now do with regards to your platform for sourcing data and for tracking what's going on and what the different factors are in the agricultural sector?
Okay, so for your first question on team and team building, those weekly XM meetings were my favorite meeting. I don't get to attend them anymore. I don't get to attend most weekly meetings of any kind for any team at this point. We're over 100 people. So it's really hard. It's what I love doing, but I also chose the job of CEO, so that ends up meaning that I have to give up a lot of things that I was the least qualified person to do, and you bring in qualified people to do it. No, the scaling team part is literally just very, very tight and strict metrics around what we will and will not hire. And I think that just, like, codifying that and then scaling that was just a process. And I think doing it right was better than doing it wrong and trying to undo what we built incorrectly. The second part about building people up versus hiring externally, it's a balancing act. For us, we have people that are team leads, our head of front-end engineering, our lead data scientist, one of our senior product managers. All of them are actually people that joined the company when we first started 5 years ago, which for startup kind of land is actually really hard to find people that stay through. And a lot of them were basically grown into team managers, and that we continue to support as managers. That said, as a team really grows, and also we deal at very kind of high levels, when you have a problem and you have 3 weeks to solve something, bringing in the world's best at something is also a solution. And so it's not an either or. We all have to aspire to bring in, I always say every time you hire someone that you think can replace you and replace you better. Because if we don't do that, then you also are not doing your job. So it's a combination. I mean, I think at this point, our age range in the company, we have high school interns every year. We actually do a summer internship for young girls that are coding in high school. So in the summer, our age range really drops down to like about the 10th grade. But in average, we're basically dealing with, I think our youngest employee is about 20 and our oldest is in his late 60s. And so it's the full spectrum. Trading it doesn't play much of a role because frankly speaking, trading teaches you to do one thing and do one thing well, make money for yourself. You're not working in a team most times. So most times, being a really good trader means that you could also be a horrible manager. So I had to learn everything else after I left because none of my job and the kind of incentive structures I had around my old job had anything to do with building a team, designing a product. If I did, I designed the product and I held it to myself. It was not about sharing. So I've actually had to unlearn a lot of things. The only thing that I would say the role that trading plays for me is you make money and you also lose money when you're trading. You're not always winning. And that extreme volatility, to be a really good trader, you have to deal with the losses really well. And you could have months on end where you're committed to something and every day you walk in the office and you're losing and all your colleagues know you're losing. And you have to look in the eye and say like, I'm doing the right thing. And as an entrepreneur, as you know, the journey's not linear. Their highs are high, the lows are really low. And so I think net, I've actually learned how to deal with that up and down in such a way, because I'm like, this too shall pass becomes a very easy thing to kind of internalize.
My question is for Elaine. They're telling me like I'm the only one standing between us being done. And anyway, so my question was that how do you balance that, there is such a huge opportunity in AI for healthcare for underserved communities, but then there's also such an opportunity for exploitation, right? Because like their data being exploited, stuff like that. How do you, what are some of the your thoughts on how to balance those needs?
Could I add to it before you answer? My question would just go from that and say, what are the applications for AI in healthcare that you see that we should be working on? Because I'm sure there are people here who care about healthcare. I do, especially in low resource settings that could, make a big impact in the near future.
Yeah. So I would say the first step to avoid exploitation is having the communities that you're trying to help be involved in creating a solution. Because if they're not involved, then you're assuming that you understand what your problem is without actually talking to them about what your problem is. Then the second step is making sure that the solutions we're developing are actually addressing the problems that they should be addressing and not something else. And having a constant reevaluation process. So not just creating an algorithm that works one time and then you think you're done, but always going back and making sure the algorithm is doing what you wanted it to do. And as you so if you're working with a system that has like real-time update of data, making sure that the data has not changed what you're trying to produce. And also understanding the biases in the data sets that we're using is important. It's not always easy to take away those biases, but acknowledging that those biases exist, and so the systems that we're creating have limitations because of those biases, I think it's very important. So if someone is using your algorithm to apply to specific health problems, they know where they cannot apply that algorithm and where they can apply that algorithm. In terms of healthcare, I think it's so broad, but one of my interests is definitely looking at the increase in the prevalence of non-communicable diseases in Africa, because I think it's going to be a really big problem if we do nothing about it. So educating people about healthy habits, but also just looking, right now, I just want to understand what does it look like? What do people think about these risk factors? What do people think about tobacco use? What do people think about alcohol consumption? And basically creating a baseline of understanding of what that looks like currently on the continent, and then starting to build systems that will monitor changes over time, and then think about what kinds of interventions can we develop, how can we implement these interventions, who should be involved in developing these interventions, how can we get leaders in the communities to be involved in creating these interventions and encouraging people to actually use the things that are being created.
My question is up to Matt. You mentioned of your challenge that you face when you are training a model because you need computational power to train it. And when it comes to the African continent, one of my mentors said something that before we can develop them, we need to own technology. And if you can't own technology, then which means you always lag behind. So what do you propose? From our point of view, when I'm training a model, my laptop sometimes will crash. Where I'm from, load shedding and power will go off, then which means you have to start all over again. So sometimes it takes time and people might even give up. Okay, so do we have to look into research areas whereby we have lesser research into lesser modules whereby we don't need deep neural networks, whereby we can have lesser neural network which can perform the same way as deep ones that you need the Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services to train? Or do we need something else so that when it comes to our part of the world, we can also compete in the same way the other people are doing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know if I have a particular answer for that. I mean, I think we are obviously seeing compute prices drop relatively quickly, and I think that demand, and kind of the prices will continue to fall. Certainly, there are plenty of initiatives, both looking at kind of like kind of like few-shot learning and stuff like that, low compute resource models, low sample models, et cetera. I'm not sure. I mean, I think from my perspective, like the opportunities to develop models on a cluster. What I think we need is really kind of like a multi institution compute center, and maybe that's something that could be implemented to kind of like allow access and give researchers the opportunity to develop the models that they want to develop. But outside of that, and outside of kind of like technical approaches to this, I don't know if there's really like an answer to that. Just kind of like, hopefully wait and pray for the prices to drop. Maybe, I'm not sure.
I think we are going to stop here for questions. Please join me to thank the speakers for the keynotes today and the panel discussion this afternoon.
I want to especially thank, of course, our keynote speakers and our oral speakers who have given us talks today. We also want to especially thank our sponsors. Part of what we do, part of organizing this workshop is to think of lots of logistic issues and financial issues. Thanks to our sponsors, they've made that work much, much easier. So all our sponsors in the house, thank you so very much. We thank you for your partnership with Black in AI, and we hope that you continue that in years to come. I also want to thank our volunteers. We had some amazing, so everyone you see on those branded, beautiful blue Black in AI t-shirt helped us today one way or the other. We want to especially thank you for making this event a success. We also want to thank our allies. There's been lots of affinity events today, and you've made our time to join us today. We want to say a big thank you. Even those who helped us with putting out the visa fires. Some are present here today, some are not. We really appreciate the work that you're doing, and we're happy that we're not fighting alone. So 2 quick announcements. The evening poster session would happen at 6:30 today. So same place where we had the session, but now a larger session with other affinity groups. So at 6:30, poster session will be happening down there. Remember that we have to vote for the best poster. So as you see those posters and you interact with the presenters, think of which of them you want to vote for as your favorite. So the poster session holds at the same place at 6:30. If you are a presenter for a poster, please ensure that you remove your posters when you're done presenting, or perhaps you ask somebody to help you remove it if you won't be there to the end. But please make sure you have a means of removing your posters at the end. And yes, we have the awesome and amazing Black in AI dinner on Friday. We look forward to having all of you join us on Friday at the Sheraton Vancouver World Center. It's about 10 minutes or less drive from here, so we hope to see everyone on Friday. Yes, so winners of the Best Poster Award based on the voting you do today, and the Best Oral Award based on the judge's decision will be announced at the dinner. So looking forward to seeing you on Friday. Thankfully, I think for the first time we have the workshop and the dinner separated by 4 days, which means we have more time to build the relationships that we've made today. So thank you and see you on Friday.